Alright, this is the second video about Autoglosser. This one is the program specification, and the first video, which you should have watched before this, is the video explaining what Autoglosser solves and why that might matter. Let's talk about specifications and capabilities. I have prepared a specification in the form of 5 checklists of features for the program to have, plus footnotes, plus this video. It looks like a long checklist, but that's because it's full of descriptions that are really thorough in order to avoid any possible confusion. The program really only has to be able to do a few things handily, and I have kept the design minimal. There may be a few more fine details that aren't in here, but I think I've designed the description so that whoever programs this only has to decide programmer stuff like code algorithms and data structures, and just a few other minor decisions like what the buttons look like. And this should amply make it easy to communicate about whatever else needs deciding, and I'll be available on the Discord to have those conversations. What follows is like there's a small pile of nuts and bolts, and I wrote a description of it that runs the length of a novel. I've heard that program specifications are supposed to be something like that, but this is the first time I'm trying, but I am schooled in engineering drawings for mechanical and structural parts and assemblies, and this is pretty similar. Plus, I know how to make videos, and a program specification in the form of a video basically makes it a look-alike prototype, if I'm understanding those categories right. Addendum note, I rendered the first 7 minutes of this video and shared it with the collabs, and we've already iterated up some of the features to different from how they're described here. Now the point of this video is to make a full description of the first iteration of the design, so we all have that as a common base, and then iteration can continue off of that. Okay, the checklist of features has 5 sections. 1 for translation mode, 1 for map mode, 1 for pagination mode, 1 for video mode, and 1 for miscellaneous. I've arranged these checklists into a sequence that's good for reviewing the features once you know them, but to get you acquainted with them, it will be better if I describe a workflow and jump around these checklists. Alright, translation mode roughly corresponds to my WordPad document with the matching translations and a pronunciation plus a gloss. To avoid using both the words gloss and glossary, let's say that the list of translations of individual words is the word mapping, or map for short, and map mode roughly corresponds with my WordPad document with the word mapping. Pagination mode and video mode roughly correspond with what I was using Photoshop and a video editor for. So instead of this WordPad document plus this WordPad document plus Photoshop plus the video editing program, there's the program Autoglosser with its translation mode, map mode, pagination mode, and video mode. Another note about terminology, I'm going to use the word source language to refer to whatever language is being translated from. So in a translation from Chinese to English, the source language is Chinese, so the word source here doesn't refer to the source code or any external document like an ancient scroll. Alright, suppose we have a new project open in Autoglosser. Now, translation mode and map mode are both blank, and this prototype doesn't look exactly like what the program should look like, but close enough. Okay, checklist item 1-1. User can click on the import source text button. A text box appears, he pastes text into it, presses go, and the program appends that text to the bottom of the work in progress as a source text. Let's suppose that the user clicks on that import source text button and then pastes this text into it and presses go. Now, since that's appended to a blank project, the source text in translation mode is now these 4 lines. Now, each of these Chinese characters is treated as one word each. There's a pronunciation displayed under each one, but they all start as just a dash character, and there's glosses for each word. They also all start as just a dash character. And each line has a translation that says lorem. Below that, there's a paragraph that says lorem, 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 lorem. Okay, there's a few things going on here already. The smallest unit of source text is a character. The next bigger unit of source text is a word. Right now, all the words are being treated as single characters. So right now there's 36 Chinese characters and 36 words, 1 character each. The next bigger unit of source text is a line. There's 4 lines now. The next bigger unit of source text is a chunk. Upon importing, each line is a chunk. So there's 4 lines and 4 chunks, and each chunk is 1 line right now. Where there's that paragraph with the 4 lorems, that's paragraph form, and everything above that is the lines and chunks form. Checklist item 1-17. User can add and remove chunk breaks. A chunk break means where one chunk ends and another one begins. Let's suppose we want the first two lines to be one chunk and the bottom two lines to be one chunk. When we remove the chunk break between the first and second lines, it merges their translations. So now there's one translation item for the two lines together, and it says lorem lorem. And suppose we do that the same to the other two lines. Okay, so now there's still 4 lines, but now there's only 2 chunks. Chunk 1 is lines 1 and 2, and chunk 2 is lines 3 and 4. The point of this is sometimes you don't want to have lines of translation for every line of source text. So the first line has Chinese pronunciation and gloss, then there's line 2's Chinese pronunciation and gloss, and now one translation that's corresponding to both lines added together. Checklist item 1-19. User can change the translation of a chunk. Whenever a translation of a chunk is changed, the paragraph form updates. The pilcrow character, this looks like a backwards P with 2 stems, in the translation becomes a paragraph break in the paragraph form, but remains a pilcrow character in the translation of the chunk. Okay, let's say the user types in a translation of the first chunk, so he changes it from lorem lorem to Bob went to the shopping mall last Tuesday, and changes the translation of the second chunk to he ate some potatoes there, they were delicious. And now the paragraph form automatically updates, and it has the translations for both of those chunks joined together. And now suppose the user adds a pilcrow character before they were delicious in his translation of chunk 2, and now paragraph form has 2 paragraphs, and the break between them corresponds to where he put that pilcrow character in the chunk translation. The paragraph form is constrained to the lines and chunks form. Whenever the translation of a chunk changes, the change also applies in paragraph form, but paragraph form can't be edited directly. The Chinese text in translation mode is not constrained to anything. If the user had copied that in from some other document on his computer, the program isn't keeping track of that. Alright, let's get more acquainted with translation mode. In the course of this video, I'm going to cover all the checklist items for all the modes, plus all the notes that go with those in the specification. One I already covered but didn't cite yet. Checklist item 1-4. Upon importing source text, each word's pronunciation starts as just a dash character, and each word's gloss starts as just a dash character, as we've seen. And the letter Y in those checklist items is just a version number. For example, checklist item Y1-4 means item 1-4 in version Y of the checklist. The number to the left of the dash indicates what section in the checklist it is. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And the number to the right of the dash is just sequential within those lists. Okay. Next. Translation mode, note 1. Source text refers to the text in translation mode in the original language, the work being translated. It does not refer to whatever the text was imported from. Now that we have this example on screen, these Chinese characters in this example are what we call the source text. Alright, next item. Checklist item 1-8. User can click and change words in the source text after importing and delete words and add words. For example, let's suppose that the next thing the user does is select this word and delete it, and then the same for this word, and then decides to add these 3 words at the start of this line. Those are all valid operations. Again, the source text in translation mode isn't constrained to anything. The program is not keeping track of what other document on the computer this text was imported from. Next item. Checklist item 1-16. User can add and remove line breaks in the source text. Let's suppose the next thing the user does is remove the line break in the second chunk and then adds line breaks by the first and last commas of that chunk. Now that second chunk is 3 lines. This doesn't do anything to the translation of the chunk. The second chunk is still one chunk with the same start and end as before that operation, and each chunk has one chunk translation. This one's being, he ate some potatoes there, they were delicious. Those changes in line breaks only affect the source text and the pronunciation and glosses they move along with the source text, wherever the line breaks are. Next item. Checklist item 1-22. User can export the source text with the line breaks from translation mode. Now that we've messed with the source text a little, let's suppose we want to have the new source text all by itself in a word processor. And now the user presses the export source text button, and suppose that copies it to the clipboard, and then the user goes to a blank WordPad document and presses Ctrl-V, and now that document has the source text per what's in Autoglosser's translation mode with our modifications applied. Next item, checklist item 1-10. User can click to gloss a word to whatever he types in, including changing glosses on words that already have glosses here in translation mode work. Alright, let's start changing those dash characters into something more useful. After I show you map mode, I'll show you how auto-glossing works, but for now let's look at the operation of glossing a word to whatever the user types in. Let's suppose the user selects this word and then clicks on the button gloss-custom, then whatever he types in next becomes the gloss for that word. Suppose he types in Alfred, now the gloss for this word is Alfred. Now suppose he clicks on the same word and does gloss-custom again and types in Bob, now the gloss for this word is Bob. With gloss-custom you can set or change any word's gloss here in translation mode to anything you type in. Next, a similar thing for the pronunciations of words, but it's slightly more complicated. Checklist item 1-12. There's a setting called pronunciation system and it can be set to pinyin or other. Let's see why that might be called for. Checklist item 1-13. User can click to set the pronunciation of a word to whatever he types in, including changing the pronunciation on words that already have pronunciations here in the translation mode work. When the user types in a pronunciation and the setting for the pronunciation system is set to pinyin, the program automatically converts tone numbers into tone marks and converts V into U with 2 dots above it. See translation mode note 3 for the pinyin notation conversions. Aha. Some systems of writing pronunciations use a lot of characters that you don't find on an ordinary keyboard. When we're dealing with Chinese, these systems of writing pronunciations using the letters we're familiar with from English is called romanization. The letters we use in English are called the Roman letters, and they're common to many other languages like German, French, and Spanish. Chinese is written in these characters that are not Roman letters, so that's why it's called romanization when we spell the sounds using Roman letters. The most popular romanization system for Chinese is called pinyin, which is used by North Americans who speak English, and it's also used by Europeans who speak English, German, French, Spanish, etc. If you've seen Chinese words spelled with strange uses of Q's, X's, and ZH's, then you've probably encountered pinyin, and if you didn't know how to read pinyin, then it was probably a mystery to you how you're supposed to use those Q's and X's and ZH's, and that's because pinyin is just weird in places, but once you know it, it's a very useful code for writing sounds. Well, pinyin uses a lot of letters with marks above them, roughly 30 of these, and that's why it's useful to have a converter so you can write a letter and then a numeral and have the program just automatically convert that to a letter with a mark above it. Translation mode note 3, here's the scheme for converting tone numbers into tone marks. And blah blah blah, I'm not going to read all that, but that describes all the shorthands for typing using ordinary keyboard buttons and auto-converting those to special characters. It's pretty standard. And it's got a complete list of all of them, not just description. Okay, so let's suppose the user selects this character and then clicks the button pronunciation-custom, and suppose he types in BA1, and suppose the pronunciation setting is on pinyin. And now the pronunciation of this character shows up as B and then A with a horizontal line above it. And now suppose the user selects the same character and clicks on pronunciation-custom and types in DA2. Now the pronunciation of this character shows up as D and then A with an upward sloping line above it. And now suppose the user changes the pronunciation setting to other, then selects this character and clicks on the button pronunciation-custom and types in BA1, and now the pronunciation does show up as BA1 with no special characters. When the pronunciation setting is on other, then whatever the user types in for a pronunciation is what's assigned as the pronunciation, none of that auto-converting. It's only when the pronunciation setting is on pinyin that the program does the automatic conversion to special characters. Okay, next checklist item. This one has a few details that we haven't got to yet. Checklist item 1-24. User can save a translation mode work. Saves include source text, pronunciations, glosses, translations, line breaks, chunk breaks, and page breaks, all the stuff that translation mode deals with. And saves in translation mode also include the information to save about pagination mode, and which is just the font sizes, and saves in translation mode also include the information to save about video mode, which is just the font sizes, timestamps, and fade duration. We'll get to that later, what that stuff in pagination and video mode is. But saves in translation don't save the stuff that map mode deals with. Okay. We haven't got to that stuff about pagination mode and video mode and what information is saved about those, but a save in translation mode mostly saves the information about the stuff we're dealing with in translation mode. So let's suppose the user clicks on File, Save Translation, and then the program asks where to save and what file name to save as. So suppose he chooses a location on his computer and types in the name wordguy.agt, where AGT is short for Autoglosser Translation, and after clicking the Go button, a save file is written to his computer. Checklist item 1-25, user can load a translation mode work. Now let's suppose the same user was also working on a translation of The Art of War the previous day and wants to resume work on it. He clicks File, Load Translation, navigates to C/translations on his computer, and finds his work, bingfa.agt, selects it, presses Go. Okay, now everything about the current project is unloaded from memory. Good thing we saved it to storage before loading something else. And the user's translation work in progress for that other book is loaded into translation mode. And if the user does some work on that, saves it, and loads his save of wordguy.agt, then bingfa is unloaded from memory, and we're back into this project in progress. So the save file contains all the information required to save and load projects, states like that. Source text, pronunciations, glosses, translations, line breaks, chunk breaks, etc. And when I say unloaded from memory, I just mean, are you sure you want to load and discard all changes to whatever you're working on in here? Okay. And if you saved, then you've got that stuff saved. Okay. Now just a couple of miscellaneous things about translation mode, and then we'll look at map mode. And after that, some more final details about translation mode and map mode. Okay. Checklist item 1-26. Control-V works as a keyboard shortcut to paste from clipboard, and Control-C works as a keyboard shortcut to copy to clipboard when editing the gloss of a word, or when editing the pronunciation of a word, or when editing the translation of a chunk. For example, if the user has some other document and then copies some text to clipboard from there, then edits this chunk's translation and presses Control-V, then whatever's in the clipboard goes there as if he typed it in. And if the user selects some part of a translation in translation mode and presses Control-C, then that copies it to clipboard, and he can paste that into a separate word processor. Checklist item 1-27. User can scroll up and down using a mouse wheel or a scroll bar. Alright, I've kept the example minimal so far because it takes a lot of photoshopping to produce this sort of demo, but suppose we have a bigger translation in progress. Here's a chunk of 3 lines, so it's 3 lines of Chinese, then pinyin, then gloss, then a translation of that whole chunk. And then we have a chunk of 4 lines, so 4 lines of Chinese, then pinyin, then gloss, then the translation of that whole chunk. And then we have a single line chunk, so this got Chinese, then pinyin, then gloss, then the translation of that. And below all that, there's paragraph form, which is all the chunk translations joined together, and the paragraph breaks are strictly where the Pilcrow characters are in the chunk translations. This is vertically bigger than a screen, so you have a vertical scroll bar and vertical scrolling with the mouse wheel. Alright, that was a bunch of basic operations of translation mode. Now let's have a look around at map mode before we get onto autoglossing and those operations that combine the uses of translation mode and map mode. Map mode, note 1. Source word refers to words in the original language, the language whose words are being translated. Likewise, source language refers to that language. For example, if the map is translating Chinese words into English, then the source language is Chinese. Yeah, a lot of these checklist sections have items that are copy-pasted from other sections or just modified slightly. Let's continue using examples of translating Chinese into English, but there will be other language examples soon as we make sure the program is ready for other pairs of languages. Checklist item 2-1. A map can have several sections. If the source language is Chinese, then the entries in each section are in alphabetical order by pinyin. If the source language is alphabetic, then the entries in each section are in alphabetical order by source language. The language could be specified at the start of a save file. For example, a map from Chinese to English could have a save file that starts with the word Chinese to indicate that the source language is Chinese. And a map from French to German could have a save file that starts with the word alphabetic to indicate that the source language is alphabetic. Alright, sections. I like building up a map with sections. For example, my map for WordGuy Scrolls 1 and 2 has a section for main ontological words like Dao, De, Tian, Di, Yin, Yang, Wan, Wu, etc. A section for very common words, a section for somewhat common words, a section for rare words, a section for negations, a section for particulate type words that don't translate directly because they're doing sentence structural things, and many other sections. Entries within a section are sorted in alphabetical order by pinyin, or if the source language were alphabetic, then the entries within a section would be sorted in alphabetical order by the source word. Checklist item 2-2. User can add a section to a map. And checklist item 2-3. User can move a word from one section of the map to another section. And checklist item 2-4. User can remove a section of a map. For example, I could take this map and add an empty section called Rare Words That Start with B, and then move whatever words I want from the Rare Words section to that new section, And if I didn't want that section anymore, then I could move the words in it back to the rare words section and make this section empty and then remove this section. And checklist item 2-6, user can remove a word from a map. I could choose some words from whatever section, for example the rare words section, and remove them from the map entirely. Checklist item 2-5, user can add a word to a map specifying which section of the map to add to, what the word is in the source language, what the pronunciation is, and what the meaning is. Okay, this is how we add words manually to a map. For example, suppose the user clicks on the Add Entry to Map button, specifies that it goes in the Rare Words section, that the word is this Chinese character, that the pronunciation is MA1, and that the meaning is scorpion, and presses the Go button, and now an entry is added to the map in that section with that information, and the A1 is converted to an A with a horizontal line above it per the same system as in translation mode. But of course, there's a checklist item for that here in map mode as well. Checklist item 2-14, when the user types in a pronunciation and the setting for the pronunciation system is set to pinyin, the program automatically converts tone numbers into tone marks and converts V into U with 2 dots above it. See translation mode note 3 for the pinyin notation conversions. Along with checklist item 2-13, there's a setting called pronunciation system, and it can be set to pinyin or other. Next, checklist item 2-7, user can change the pronunciation or the meaning of a word. In other words, you can edit map entries. Suppose the user edits this entry and says, actually the pronunciation of this word is MA4 and the meaning is porcupine, and the map entry is updated. Checklist item 2-16, user can save a map. Save of a map includes the sections, the words in the source language, the pronunciations, and the meanings. All the stuff that map mode deals with. Alright, we looked at saving in translation mode, and saves in translation mode save all the stuff we deal with in translation mode and pagination mode and video mode. But when you want to save or load a map, we do that from map mode, and saves in map mode include information for all the stuff map mode deals with, and only the stuff of map mode. None of the other modes put their information into map mode saves. Let's suppose the user clicks on File Save Map, then specifies a location on his computer and specifies a file name wordguy.agm, and agm is short for Autoglosser Map. A save file appears on his computer. Checklist item 2-17, user can load an existing map. Current map is discarded when a new one is loaded. Okay, suppose the user had been working on a map just for the Art of War the previous day and decides to load that map into map mode. He clicks File, Load Map, locates bingfa.agm on his computer, and presses Go. Now everything that was in map mode is unloaded, good thing we saved it to the hard drive, and his map for bingfa is loaded into map mode. And if he loads wordguy.agm back into map mode, then the map for bingfa is unloaded from the memory, and hey, there's all that stuff we saved when mapping for wordguy. So it's just the same like discard all changes, how that goes. Okay, now let's look at handling words with more than one possible pronunciation or meaning. Checklist item 2-8. User can type in a single meaning for a source word or multiple possible meanings. Map mode note 2 describes possible notation for this. And checklist item 2-9. For words with multiple different pronunciations, user can specify one pronunciation and the meaning when it's pronounced that way, and the other pronunciation and the meaning when it's pronounced that way. Up to 4 different pronunciations, see the same note for a notation. And checklist item 2-10. In the meaning of a word, the user can type comments between comment characters. See the same note for the notation. Okay, map mode note 2, part 1 of 3, about notation. Here's an example markup system for the various kinds of entries. I don't know if this adheres to good style for designing a markup system, so the programmer can change the markup system to something better if appropriate. This is just to demonstrate what the markup system needs to be able to do. Okay, suppose there's this Chinese character, this one, and we're in map mode and adding an entry to the map for this character. The simplest kind of entry looks like this. You got a pair of quotation marks, and inside the pair of quotation marks, there's a colon near the middle, the pronunciations to the left of that, and the meanings to the right of that, okay? So that would mean that the pronunciation is ba first tone, and the meaning is turtle. Okay, so that's when there's one pronunciation and one meaning. And now when it gets more complicated, all of these entries are always something you can type in between a pair of quotation marks. There's just going to be more marks in between there when it gets more complicated. Okay. So there can also be multiple meanings and a single pronunciation. For example, this is only a little more complicated. Got a pair of quotation marks, got a colon near the middle, one translation on the left. Correction, I meant one pronunciation to the left of the colon. two meanings on the right, separated by a comma. So that means the word is always pronounced ba first tone, but sometimes means turtle and sometimes means shoe. And there can also be comments and put between comment characters to indicate where they're comments. Okay, for example, now we just got the same example, but now with curly braces in each of the definitions. So we got turtle, and then in curly braces we have the preposition, so that's the comment. And then we got shoe, and then in curly braces more rarely. So more rarely is the comment. So everything in the curly braces was comments, and we'll see how those sometimes show up and sometimes don't pretty soon when we talk about glossing. Okay, so now some words have multiple pronunciations. So now suppose we're doing an entry for this Chinese character, a different one. And now here's the entry. It's a little more complicated. Again, all this is stuff you can put between a pair of quotation marks, which is what this is. So we got a pair of quotation marks. Inside we got some stuff in between square brackets, and then a comma, and then some more stuff in between square brackets. And within each of those pairs of square brackets, we have, just like what we were looking at before. There's a colon. To the left of the colon, there's a pronunciation. To the right of the colon, there's some number of definitions separated by commas, and comment characters are optional. So what this means, when the map entry says this, what this means is sometimes the pronunciation is wo, first tone, meaning bird, the interjection. Sometimes the pronunciation is wo, first tone, meaning down, the direction. And sometimes the pronunciation is wo, fourth tone, meaning tall, the diminutive honorific. Fantastic, and now we've become acquainted with several of the features of translation mode and of map mode, and we're ready to see how they interact, and why this program is called Autoglosser. Checklist item 1-15. User can press a button to hop to map mode at the location of the last viewing. That's from translation mode. And checklist item 2-15, user can press a button to hop back to translation mode at the location of the last viewing, and that's from map mode. Basically, you have separate tabs for different modes, and you can switch which tab you're looking at, and it saves your place where you are looking in each mode. Checklist item 1-14, user can choose a word and click a button to hop to its entry in map mode if it's there, or if it's not, to add an entry for it to map mode. And the program asks what section of the map to add it to and the pronunciation and the meaning. For example, suppose the user selects this word in translation mode, then clicks on hop to entry in map mode, and suppose the map has an entry somewhere in it for that word. Then map mode becomes visible and we're looking at where the entry is in that map. Now suppose the user hops back to translation mode and selects this word and then clicks on hop to entry in map mode, and suppose the map doesn't have an entry for that word. Then the program says, there's no entry for that word in map mode, add an entry for it or cancel. And if the user clicks on cancel, then nothing happens and the view remains on translation mode. And if the user clicks on add entry, then he's prompted to supply the information, namely the pronunciation and the meaning, and the section. Just like when we added an entry to map mode from map mode. We've finally got to glossing and autoglossing. Checklist item 1-9. User can click to gloss a word. This applies a pronunciation and a gloss to the word. Program refers to map mode. Whether the map has one meaning for that word or multiple, the program asks which one to use or to cancel glossing. If there are comment characters in the meaning in the map, program removes those in this glossing. If the map doesn't have an entry for the word, the program asks the user if he wants 1. Add a map entry for the word, or 2. Type in a gloss word here in translation mode work without adding an entry to the map, or 3. Cancel glossing. Let's have a closer look at that process. Map mode, note 2, part 2 of 3. In the example of this character with this entry, 1 pronunciation, 2 possible meanings, if the user is in translation mode and selects this character in the source text and then clicks on the gloss button, the program will ask whether to use option 1, pronunciation ba, first tone and turtle for a meaning, or 2, option 2, pronunciation ba, first tone and shoe for a meaning, or 3, cancel glossing, and comment characters do appear in this step. If the user chooses 1, then ba, first tone is applied as the pronunciation, and turtle, comment characters not included, is applied as the gloss. If the user chooses 2, then ba, first tone is applied as the pronunciation, and shoe, comment characters not included, is applied as the gloss. In the example of this character with this entry, 2 possible pronunciations, 3 total possible meanings, if the user is in translation mode and selects this character in the source text and then clicks on the gloss button, then the program will ask whether to use option 1, wa, first tone, and bird as the meaning, or 2, wa, first tone for pronunciation and down for the meaning, or option 3, wa, fourth tone for the pronunciation and tall for the meaning, or 4, cancel glossing. Like in the previous example, comment characters disappear in the gloss in translation mode if the user selects 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, in that step where it's asking you which one you want to choose, the options do show up with the comments from the comment characters, and then when you select one, it applies a gloss word here in translation mode, and that gloss does not include the comments. Okay. All that is what happens when there is an entry in map mode, and when you try to gloss a word in translation mode and there's no entry for that word in map mode, there were those 3 options. The first option is just the same as manually adding an entry to the map like we've seen before. The second option is just like typing in whatever gloss word you want in translation mode with no reference to a map, like we saw earlier. And the third option ends the dialogue with no changes. Nice, that's glossing, and that's the main point of having a translation and a map and how they interact in this program. Next, checklist item 1-11, user can click the autogloss button. Program does like when the user clicks to gloss one word, then does the same to the next word, then the one after that, and continuing until the user presses a stop button. For example, say we select this word and then hit autogloss, and suppose there's an entry with multiple options for this word in the map. Then it asks which one we want to use, then we choose one, and then it goes on to the next word. And let's say the map has no entry for it, and we choose option 1, which is to add an entry to the map. Then we supply the information for adding an entry to the map, and gloss accordingly, and then it goes on to the next word, and let's say the map has no entry for it, and we choose option 2, and just type in a gloss for it with no reference to the map. And then it goes on to the next word, and let's say the map has no entry for it, and we choose option 3, which leaves the gloss as just a dash character, then moves on to the next word, and then suppose we press the button to stop the autoglossing. That's autoglossing. If you have a hefty map that contains all or most of the words in the translation source text, you could go through that translation at a good clip, applying glosses to all the words with all the freedom to select between options whenever you run into a word that translates variously as one thing in one place and another thing in another place as suits the context each time. Okay, now we've seen the basics of translation mode, and then the basics of map mode, and now the main way those two combine in glossing and autoglossing. Next, there's a handful more notes on those 2 modes, and then we look at pagination mode, and then video mode, and then finally we are at closing remarks. Next, checklist item 1-5, the display updates as appropriate whenever there is a change to source text, gloss words, pronunciations, translations, line breaks, chunk breaks, page breaks, and whatever else that should be refreshed on screen. Where there's a word of source text and its pronunciation and its gloss, these 3 things are all aligned with each other. The previous word unit, source plus pronunciation plus gloss, is all to the left of that, and the next word unit, source word plus pronunciation plus gloss, is all to the right of it. In other words, we don't have the whole line of source text all left aligned or all center aligned, and then all the pronunciation line below that all left aligned or all center aligned, and then the series of gloss words for the line below that all left aligned or all center aligned. Alright. The first part of that item is just saying that there's never an error of screen forgot to refresh. Like if you make some change to something and the program has handled that fine in memory but hasn't refreshed the screen, then it will be showing the old state of the thing. And that's a bug, and that can be fixed by making sure the screen refreshes whenever appropriate, like after the user changes something. And the rest of that checklist item is all about alignment. Let's talk about alignment. Here I have a book called Veni Vidi Vici, or maybe it's Veni Vidi Wiki, nobody really knows for sure. And it's a book that lists several hundred Latin expressions and their translations into English plus pronunciation. Sadly, these translations are not with gloss, and it also doesn't have alignment between the Latin words and the phonetic guides. If it had those 2 features more, I would love this book dearly, but alas, I've decided I'll learn Latin some other time. Such is the effective difference between formats. Let's have a look at the alignment here. Here we have an expression made of 5 Latin words, and under that a phonetic aid using English phonology. And let's consider the actual process someone would use while reading this. First, you'd look at the Latin words and say, okay, it's something like urbum lateritium invenit marmorium reliquit. And then you'd look at the pronunciation guide and urbem latericium invenit marmorium reliquit. Okay, nice. Sounds more like Latin. And naturally, the next thing you do is to match the Latin with its actual spelling to the pronunciation. But the line of Latin is all left aligned per line, and the pronunciation is all left aligned per line and running to a second line. Now, consider what series of eye movements is required to match these up in the mind. Okay, this word is urbem, and this word is latericiam, and this word is invenit, and this word is marmoream, and this word is reliquit. And in that process, the majority of your short-term memory was loaded up in remembering where your eyes are moving along on two separate lines. It's about as good as having the two lines on opposite sides of the room. It's possible to design the product in such a way that the learner never has this kind of intrusive memory load during the process of reading, and that's the result of getting a few design things just right, and the difference to the learner is an enormous margin in utility, giving him massively more mental resources to learn the text and the language, in other words, the actual task. Here's how I would have aligned it, and also I've added a gloss. Now, how would you read this if you were just encountering it? I would read it like this. Is this one urbem? It's urbem. Is this one latericium? It's latericium. Is this one invenit? It's invenit. Is this one marmoreum? Pretty much. Is this one reliquit? It's reliquit. And the translation of the sentence is, he found the city brick and left it marble. And then urbem is city, and latericium is brick, and invenit is he found, and marmoreum is marble, and reliquit is he left. Notice how that included no short-term memory load related to eye movements, and notice how much more brain juice you had available for the actual task because of that. Also notice what happens when there's no gloss. Does urbem mean found, and latericium mean city, and invenit mean brick, and marmoreum mean left, and reliquit mean marble? This translation without gloss might be useful for an advanced learner of Latin who already knows tons of vocab, but for a beginner it renders the whole book either useless or something you could combine with a dictionary for really slow learning work. If this book had just those two improvements, a gloss and good alignment, I would actually want to learn a few hundred words of Latin and some antique sayings of wisdom, but absent of that, this is at best something you can open to a random page once every few days for a little novelty. Alright, so here's how we're aligning. This column has 3 items, and they're centered among them, and this column, items centered in it, and this column, and this column, and this column, and the width of each column is the width of its widest member. So this column is as wide as the source word, these 3 columns are as wide as the pronunciations, and this column is as wide as its gloss. What's constant is that there's the same amount of horizontal space between each of those columns at their widest. And the line altogether is centered to the screen, meaning the horizontal space between the left bound of the screen and the start of the first column is equal to the horizontal space between the right bound of the screen and the end of the last column. Note, some of the previous visuals and upcoming ones depict the alignment wrong. Just imagine I had depicted all those with this alignment scheme when you see those. Alright, coming up on the last of the items for translation mode and map mode. Checklist item 1-2, there's a setting called source text language and the user can set it to Chinese or alphabetic, and that's in translation mode. Checklist item 1-3, upon importing source text, if the setting for the source text language is set to Chinese, the program detects multi-character words in that new source text based on the map that's loaded in map mode. If it finds any, the result is that the imported text has some single-character words and some multi-character words. If it finds none, the result is that the imported text is all single-character words. Upon importing source text, if the setting for the source text language is set to alphabetic, the program detects multi-word phrases to be treated as single word units in that new source text, based on the map that's loaded into map mode. If it finds any, the result is that the imported text has some words treated as single words and some multi-word phrases treated as single words. If it finds none, the result is that the imported text has each word treated as a single word. Importing assumes the source text already has line breaks. Once done importing, translation mode has that source text with those line breaks and also has a chunk break at every line break of the imported text. Each of those chunks starts with lorem as its translation. Okay, that stuff about lines and chunks, we saw it already. Let's talk about that stuff about word units. In the first example about Bob and his potatoes, we had nothing loaded into map mode, and then when we imported the text, each Chinese character was treated as a separate word unit. That was 36 Chinese characters, 36 word units, 1 character each. Well, in Chinese, a lot of words are 1 character each, and a lot of words are 2 or more characters each. Now let's suppose we have nothing in translation mode and we have a map with this one entry. This is a 2-character word, and suppose this map entry says the pronunciation for it is Tiandi, and the meaning is shopping mall. Now suppose that in translation mode we have the source text language set to Chinese, and we import this text. Upon importing it, it will refer to the map that's loaded into map mode, and it will detect that this source text has a 2-character word. So now these 2 characters are treated as one word. So now there's 36 Chinese characters and 35 words. This word is 2 characters, and the rest of the words are 1 character each. Now there's a single dash under these 2 characters for pronunciation and a single dash for the meaning. Now suppose we select this 2-character word, click gloss, and the program should ask whether we want to use this pronunciation and meaning or cancel. Suppose we choose option 1. Now under this 2-character word there's the pronunciation Tiandi and the gloss shopping mall. Next, let's suppose we're translating from some alphabetic language to another alphabetic language. So we start a new project with nothing in translation mode and nothing in map mode, and we set the source text language to alphabetic. Now suppose we import this text. Bob ate a hot dog with no bun on a Friday. That's a total of 11 words and 10 spaces, and the spaces are going to determine where one word ends and another one starts. In Chinese, you don't really have spaces. That's why you got to have this setting, because in Chinese, you just have one character after another, and it's not clear with spaces, because there are none, which ones are 1-character words and which ones are multi-character words. Whereas in alphabetic languages, you have spaces between words. Okay. So once we load that in as source text, there's 11 word units. Each word unit is 1 word, and there's a dash under each word for pronunciation and a dash under each word for gloss. But hey, we probably want hot dog with a sequence of 2 words to be treated as 1 word unit. Now suppose we start a new project with nothing in translation mode, and we have a map in map mode with this one entry, and this entry says that hot dog means Wiener Schnitzel. So in this example, we're translating English into German, and let's say that in this example, we're not using any pronunciation system to render English sounds with German phonology, no pinyin or anything like that. Now we go to translation mode and import the same English sentence, and now the program refers to the map in map mode and detects that the source text we're importing has this 2-word expression hot dog that we want to treat as 1 word unit. So once this text is imported, there's 10 word units. This 1 word unit is 2 words, and the rest of the word units are 1 word each. Now suppose we select hot dog, the word unit, and click on gloss, select option 1, and now that 1 word unit, hot dog, is glossed as Wiener Schnitzel. Lovely. Now let's have a few features for dealing with this stuff. Checklist item 1-7. User can split multi-character words into separate single-character words in the source text if the setting for the source text language is set to Chinese. If the setting for the source text language is set to alphabetic, then the user can split apart multi-word phrases into separate single-word units. Alright, suppose we have nothing in translation mode, and in map mode we have hot dog is Wiener Schnitzel, and suppose we import this different text into translation mode. Bob and his hot dog named Fido have no air conditioning. And once we import that, the program will refer to map mode and import hot dog as 1 word unit, but in this text, clearly hot dog means a dog that is hot, not hot dog the religious sacrament. So next we would want to select hot dog the word unit and split it into 2 separate word units, 1 for hot and 1 for dog. And then we might gloss hot as Heiß and dog as Hund. Similarly, for Chinese, sometimes you have 2 characters that sometimes mean a single word and sometimes mean 2 separate words. For example, this word bu means not, and this word de means get. But when you put them together, this 2-character word, bu de, means can't. But sometimes you have the 2 words bu followed immediately by de, and it does mean not get. In which case, you want to treat them as 2 separate 1-character words. So imagine an example exactly like the hot dog and hot dog example, but we have the source text language set to Chinese, and the map contains this 2-character word bu de, and sometimes we're importing source text that contains the word bu de, and sometimes we're importing text that contains the words bu de, and we'll want to split them after the program automatically joins them upon importing. It's exactly the same as the hot dog examples, but handled differently because of Chinese and no spaces. Next, checklist item 1-6. User can join separate words into multi-character words in the source text if the setting for the source text language is set to Chinese. If the setting for the source text language is set to alphabetic, then the user can join multiple words into multi-word phrases to be treated as single word units. This is just like the previous item, but with joining rather than splitting. For example, suppose we're building up a translation and a map from scratch, and we start by importing this text with no map, so it all comes in as one-character words, and then we identify that it actually has several multi-character words, and then we add those one by one to the map, like tian di, and at that point, tian and di would be separate word units because we imported them back when we had no map loaded. So the next thing would be to join them into the one word tian di and gloss it, and likewise with all the other multi-character words you want to identify. So now we've seen examples of translating Chinese into English, including pronunciation, and we've seen translating Latin into English, including pronunciation, and we've seen translating English into German without a pronunciation. So whether the source text is Chinese or some alphabetic language, sometimes you want to include a pronunciation and sometimes you don't. Some other variations within this theme. Suppose you're translating Greek into English. Well, Greek is an alphabetic language, but it doesn't use the same alphabet as English does. In a situation like that, you'll often want to include a pronunciation line. Here's a translation from Greek into English with a pronunciation and a gloss. This doesn't require any features that I haven't already mentioned. I'm just covering some examples now of the range of things someone might want to do with the features already described so far. When you're translating from one language to another language that uses the same alphabet, a pronunciation line will less often be called for. For example, here's a translation from German into French, and it's with a gloss, but there's no pronunciation line that spells out the German sounds using French phonology. Anyone who speaks French as a first language and is learning German as a second language is going to be able to learn German phonology in a couple of hours, so this translation without the pronunciation line is assuming that whoever is reading it has already learned German phonology. What this version of the program doesn't cover so far is perhaps languages that are written right to left, so Arabic and Hebrew might not be supported in this version, and perhaps languages that do other things with letters other than writing them left to right, so Korean and Inuktitut might not be supported in this version. Okay. Next checklist item, one thing I didn't mention yet, in translation mode you can have one translation or two. Like when I was translating Word Guy Scroll 1 with reference to the one existing translations, I would want to have two translations showing up in translation mode, one being the other guy's translation that I'm referring to just for help, and the other being the translation that I'm building up. Other reasons you might want to have two translations, you might be making two translations of one thing at the same time, like one more literal translation and one more interpretive translation. So a literal translation could read just like you took the gloss and rearranged the words into a grammatical order, and the interpretive translation is where you can take more license and make it sound more natural to the language you're translating to and what you're really thinking about. Another reason you might want to have two translations in translation mode is you might have two different existing translations of some work and they're both copyright free, and all you're doing in translation mode is comparing them, maybe adding a gloss to them, and matching them up to the original text line by line. Checklist item 1-20. User can import a translation in the translated to language with line breaks if there's currently one translation in translation mode. The program matches up the lines of the imported translation with the lines of the source text. Correction, I probably should have said the program matches up lines of the imported translation with the chunks of the source text. If there's already one translation, user can specify if he wants 1. The imported translation replaces translation 1, or 2. The translation that was there before importing becomes translation 1 and the imported translation becomes translation 2, or 3. The translation that was there before importing becomes translation 2 and the imported translation becomes translation 1. If there are already two translations in translation mode, user can specify whether he wants 1, the imported translation replaces translation 1, or 2, the imported translation replaces translation 2. Alright, so when you use this feature, the program is going to assume you already did line breaks in the translation you're importing to match it up to the line breaks in the source text. Corresponding correction, you put the breaks at the chunk breaks, not the line breaks. So let's say I'm in the process of making this translation and I decide I want to bring in Bob's translation. First, I'll take Bob's translation and apply line breaks to match up where I've put them in the source text. And next, I'll press the Import Translation button. And now, if I choose option 1, then my translation goes away and Bob's translation becomes the one translation now in translation mode. Or if I select option 2, then my translation becomes translation 1 and Bob's translation becomes translation 2. Or if I select option 3, then Bob's translation becomes translation 1 and my translation becomes translation 2. Suppose I select option 3. Now Bob's translation is translation 1 and my translation is translation 2. And now suppose I take Alfred's translation, apply line breaks to it, and press import translation. And now if I select option 1, then Bob's translation goes away, Alfred's translation becomes translation 1, and my translation remains translation 2. Or if I select option 2, then my translation goes away, Bob's translation remains translation 1, and Alfred's translation becomes translation 2. Next, checklist item 1-21. User can remove translation 1 or translation 2 if there's 2 translations in translation mode. After removing one, then there's just one translation. Suppose I swapped in Alfred's translation in place of Bob's translation, so now Alfred's translation is translation 1 and my translation is translation 2. Now if I press the remove translation button and select 1, then Alfred's translation goes away and my translation remains as the 1 translation. Or if I press remove translation and select 2, then my translation goes away and Alfred's translation remains as the 1 translation. The next checklist item is something I put there for converting between traditional and simplified Chinese characters using some other converter program. Suppose I've just done a translation from Chinese to English using traditional Chinese characters, and now I want to make a variation that has simplified Chinese characters instead. Checklist item 1-23. User can import and swap out the source text for replacement. If the user supplies a new source text with the same number of line breaks as the source text being swapped out, then the new source text comes in, replacing line per line. If the new source text has fewer line breaks than the existing source text, then it only replaces as many lines as it has. If the new source text has more line breaks than the existing source text, then it replaces all the source text, and lines in excess of that are also added, and, as in import source text, those lines start as single line chunks with lorem for translations of each of those chunks. And now I can use some other program for converting from traditional to simplified. What I'll do then is I'll export the source text in traditional, I'll put it through Google Translate, set to translate Chinese traditional to Chinese simplified, or any other program that does that kind of conversion. And then I'll use import and swap out and give it the simplified that came out of that converter. Assuming the conversion from traditional to simplified kept all the line breaks the same, essentially what this process does is swap out all the traditional Chinese characters for simplified. There might be other uses for import and swap out, but I didn't think of them. And that's all the notes on translation mode. And now let's look at the last of the notes for map mode. Checklist item 2-11. User can merge 2 different maps. For words that appear in both maps with different meanings, the program merges them, but with a split notation to indicate there was a merge. Map mode note 2 describes possible notation for this. And checklist item 2-12. User can take a meaning with a split notation and flatten it. See same note. And that note, map mode, note 2, part 3 of 3, one last notation mark. Suppose the user has just merged 2 maps, and map 1 had an entry for this character as new, fire, and map 2 had an entry for the same character as new, hat. Once those maps are merged, the resulting map will have one entry for that character, and it will be new, fire, in pointy brackets, comma, new, hat, in pointy brackets, and all between a pair of quotation marks, because all these notations, the entry is always something you can type in between a pair of quotation marks. If the user clicks to flatten that entry, then it will become simply new, 1 pronunciation, 2 meanings, fire or hat. Okay, so what's the point of all that? Well, I like making maps that are specific to this or that particular book. So let's suppose I made a map for Word Guy Scroll 1, and for this character here, I have the meanings true and solid, and suppose I made a map for the Art of War, and for the same character, I have strong. Now, suppose I want to merge those maps and start translating some other work that I'm not very familiar with. Now I merge the maps, and the resultant map has an entry for this character that says, in pointy brackets, true, comma, solid, comma, in pointy brackets, strong. So that's split notation. In the pointy brackets on the left, it has just what the first map had for it, and in the pointy brackets on the right, it has just what the second map had for it. Okay. And now suppose I'm thinking, well, this word really means true or solid, and when it's used to mean strong in the Art of War, that's kind of a figurative use. So now that I'm taking this map on some other adventure, I only want the entry to have true and solid, but not strong. So then I click on flatten entry, and now it's true, comma, solid, comma, strong. Plain notation where you just got the pronunciation on the left and 3 possible meanings on the right, separated with commas. And now I just manually delete the word strong from that, and it's true, comma, solid. So what was the point of these steps with the split notation and then the flattening and then the manually editing? The point of the split notation is it's just a way for the program to say, Hey user, this is where your maps combine entries upon merging. Please resolve this before using this map, and in the meantime I'll keep track of what the separate maps had for this character. So the way I would use this is when I merge two maps, I'll see where that comes up with split notation, and I'll be able to see how the words were used differently in the different books that pertain to those maps that I've merged, and then I can decide what I want the new map to have based on knowing all that. And that's all the checklist items and notes for translation mode and map mode. Next, pagination mode, then video mode, then closing remarks. Suppose we've finished a translation using these wonderful features described earlier, and now we want to format it for printing. Checklist item 3-1, pagination mode is for paginating the lines and chunks form of the translation. The paragraph form does not appear in pagination mode. See pagination mode note 1. I didn't mention yet what the point of having translation mode showing the lines and chunks form and then the paragraph form below that. The point of that is just to give the user two different ways of looking at his translation in progress. It's the forest and the trees thing. When you're working in the matching translation format, your attention naturally goes to the level of individual words and away from paragraph level thoughts. So let's say I've been working on a translation in the lines and chunks form for 20 minutes, and now I feel like scrolling down to the paragraph form, and that's going to facilitate seeing the thing in a broader scope. It's useful for refreshing up on what the text is actually doing on the level of meaning. Then suppose I review the paragraph form for a couple of minutes and then it's back to the lines and chunks form to keep progressing the translation. Or as Coach from Left 4 Dead 2 said, keep going at him like that. Pagination mode, note 1. Let's assume that if the user wants to print just the paragraph form translation, he can Control-C that out from translation mode onto an ordinary word processor, so pagination mode is only for dealing with the lines and chunks form. Suppose I've just finished a translation and one form of the translation I want to have is just how it shows up in paragraph form. Okay, I can Control-C that out, paste it into WordPad or whatever book designers use. No need for Autoglosser to handle that. Pagination mode is for lines and chunks form. Checklist item 3-2. The page is letter-sized paper, 8.5 inches by 11 inches, ordinary home printer paper. The printable area is that minus the margins. The margins are, I don't know, say 3/4 of an inch on the left and right and top and bottom. Assume it's some hard-coded value that can't be changed. And the page size is also hard-coded and can't be changed. Pagination mode, note 2. When printing on letter-sized paper, lines of original text plus pronunciation plus gloss don't fit very long lines. The Art of War translation plus Pinyin plus gloss by Gregory C. Richter is formatted to letter-sized paper and has at most about 11 words per line at about 11-point font. But Richter didn't chunk together lines and translate them in chunks of lines. He gave a short translation for each line. Since Autoglosser supports chunking lines together and having one block of translation per chunk, that helps deal with the limitations in line length. Right, so here's Richter's translation with gloss of the Art of War. He's broken down all the lines short to fit with glosses on letter-sized paper. Conveniently, the Art of War does lend itself to that kind of short chunking, as do the Tao Te Ching and Word Guy, but many works don't, including other ones I'm interested in. But that's not a problem because of chunking. Remember, a chunk can have any number of lines, so a chunk of 4 lines has 1 line's source, pronunciation, and gloss, then same for the next line, and the next one, and the next one, and then the chunk of 4 lines has 1 translation. So that's how we can break any text down into short lines and still translate per chunk, where a chunk is any number of lines together. And the lines have to be short because you just can't fit much gloss horizontally on a piece of printer paper. For a book like the Tao Te Ching or the Art of War, which are about 5,000 to 6,000 Chinese characters in total, short books, I imagine a print form of a matching translation with gloss would have dimensions something like this book. It's a very thin stack of very wide pages. Next, we have the exact same note about alignment that we covered when talking about translation mode with the Latin example. Checklist item 3-3, blah, 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 that's exact same about the alignment where you got each column center aligned and then the spaces are between the widest point in each column. Okay, checklist item 3-5. In translations of chunks, Pilcrow marks are hidden, and in pagination mode, they don't do any formatting thing. Recall, the Pilcrow marks are applied in chunk translations, but only determine where the paragraph breaks are in paragraph form. As pagination mode is for the lines and chunks form, it deals with the line breaks and the chunk breaks, but not the Pilcrows. Alright, some display options. Checklist item 3-7, user can set whether the print form will or won't include the gloss in a matching translation. And checklist item 3-8, user can set whether the print form will or won't have pronunciation in a matching translation. And checklist item 3-9, if there are two translations in translation mode, user can set whether the print form will have translations 1 and 2 both, or just translation 1, or just translation 2, or neither. If there is one translation in translation mode, user can set whether the print form will have that translation or none. So these settings are all about what shows up in the print form we're paginating. Suppose I've prepared a translation with pronunciation and gloss, and I want to print a bunch of different forms of it, like my Word Guy Scroll 1 homemade scrolls. I want one print form to have, say, the source and pronunciation and gloss and translation, and say I want another print form to have just the source and the translation with no pronunciation and no gloss, and whatever else. These settings are all just for that, determining what to show and what to hide in pagination mode. Okay, the wording of this next one is a little confusing. Checklist item 3-6, line breaks in translations of chunks are handled automatically by the program, not specified by the user. Clarification, line breaks in the source text are specified by the user in translation mode. Okay, by that I just mean like when you type a paragraph into a word processor and it automatically determines what word a line ends on and what word the next line starts on, and the autoglosser should do that automatically for a chunk translation, like a word processor does for a paragraph. I should have used word wrap, I remember that word later. Okay, so if your chunk translation is a paragraph long, it might need to show up on a page as 5 lines of text, and Autoglosser handles that automatically as a word processor does. So I wasn't talking about any special line break characters or anything like that. Next thing about display, checklist item 3-10, user can set the font size for the source text, can set the font size for the pronunciation text, can set the font size for the gloss text, and can set the font size for the translation text. These 4 settings apply to all pages of the whole document in pagination mode. Like in the Latin example, you definitely want the pronunciation line to be in a smaller font than the source line. If I used the same font sizes for all these, then the pronunciations would be dwarfing everything else, and besides, having the right sizes for each of these items is nice on the eyeballs for the reader for comprehension. Remember about alignment though, the width of each column is the width of its widest member, so every time one of these font sizes is changed, the program will have to redo the computations pertaining to all that alignment stuff. Like right now, this pronunciation is wider than the source and the gloss for this word, so the previous word is all left of that and the next word is all right of that, but if I shrunk the pronunciation font size really small, then the source word would be wider than the pronunciation and the alignment to the words left and right would now be based on how wide this one is. Okay. Checklist item 3-4, the translation of a chunk is center aligned to the page except if //l/ appears somewhere in that translation. If //l/ appears in chunk translation, pagination mode shows everything before that symbol center aligned and everything after that symbol left aligned, and the //l/ mark itself is hidden. That might be a really stupid markup character. It doesn't have to be //l//, but supposing it is, the point of this is that sometimes you want to have a translation of a chunk followed by a note, and you might want the translation part to be center aligned to the page and then the note left aligned below that. So if I want this chunk's translation to be these 2 sentences followed by this note, I will, in translation mode, edit the chunk's translation, type those 2 sentences, and then //l//, and then that note, and that's how it shows up in translation mode with the symbol there and no alignment thing. And then in pagination mode, it will show up as this center aligned and this left aligned. Okay, let's look next at what's valid for printing and what's not. Checklist item 3-11, if there are any lines that don't fit on a page horizontally, program tells the user which lines will have to be broken into shorter lines in order to fit. For example, if we have this line of source and pronunciation and gloss, then the program considers the font size settings, does that alignment stuff, and determines how long that line will be printed on paper. If it's short enough to fit between the margins on a piece of paper, then the line is valid for printing. If the line is too long to fit between the margins on a piece of paper, then the line is not valid for printing. Wherever there are these lines that are too long, pagination mode tells the user which lines have that issue. Then the user can decide to split the text into more lines by adding more line breaks, or shrink the font size. That's how we determine valid and invalid horizontally. How about vertically? Checklist item 1-18, user can add and remove page breaks. Okay, so there was one item from translation mode left that we didn't cover yet. Alright, recall. There are lines, and the user can add or remove line breaks. And then some line breaks also have chunk breaks with them, and those chunk breaks determine which lines are grouped into which chunks. Let's take that one step further and say that some chunk breaks also have page breaks with them, and those determine which groups of chunks are on which pages. So if here there's somewhere in the middle of this thing we got a chunk break and a page break, then this chunk, then a chunk break, then this chunk, then a chunk break and a page break after that, that means we're proposing to print these two chunks on a given page. Checklist item 3-12, if there are any pages, sets of chunks between page breaks that don't fit on a page vertically, program tells the user which ones they are. And this should say if there are any proposed pages that don't fit on a page vertically, so I'm not using the word page to mean two different things. And in this example, these two chunks are one proposed page. Well, if that will fit on a page vertically, then it's a valid page vertically. And if it won't fit on a page vertically, then it's not a valid page vertically. And wherever there are any proposed pages that are too tall, invalid, won't fit on a piece of paper vertically, pagination mode tells the user where those are, and he can add more page breaks to fix it up and make sure all the proposed pages do fit on actual pieces of paper. And if all the lines are valid in the sense of fitting horizontally, and if all of the proposed pages are valid in the sense of fitting vertically, then the work is valid for printing. Then checklist item 3-13, user can output to a multi-page PDF. The output to PDF should be ready for printing on an ordinary printer using a PDF viewer, but only if all those conditions are satisfied. If there are any lines that are too long to fit horizontally, or any proposed pages that are too tall to fit vertically, then output to PDF is not allowed. So let's suppose a user has just finished a translation, but his line breaks and page breaks are still tentative. Then he goes to pagination mode and it tells him where some lines won't fit horizontally. Then he adds more line breaks to make sure all the lines fit horizontally. And then he goes into pagination mode and it tells him where some proposed pages won't fit vertically. And then he adds more page breaks to make sure all the proposed pages fit vertically. Then he goes to pagination mode and it says all those matters of fitting pages are now valid. Then he does output to PDF, specifies a location and a file name on his computer, and then a PDF appears there on his computer. Then he opens it using a PDF viewer like Firefox, clicks File, Print, then Go, and then the printer on his desk applies ink to paper in this great culmination of his work and the work of the people who made Autoglosser. Then he drives a staple through it and says, "I have printed my translation, all by myself." And ideally then later some other people read that translation and they end up saying, "I have learned this text all by myself," and never acknowledging the work of the people who made it possible, and all the real heroes just kind of fade into the background. The final note about pagination mode, and this one's actually erroneous. Pagination mode note 3, see translation mode item 1-24 about saves. Saves in translation mode contain the stuff to save about the work in pagination mode, which is just the font sizes plus whatever's going on in translation mode, and the stuff to save about video mode. That's not quite right. The stuff to save about pagination mode includes the font sizes plus the settings about whether pronunciation is shown or hidden, whether gloss is shown or hidden, whether 2 or 1 or 0 translations are shown or hidden, and maybe I forgot some other things. In any case, whatever there is to save about the work in pagination mode saves in translation mode with the extension AGT, Autoglosser Translation, are where those are saved along with all the stuff to save about translation mode works. Revise item 1-24 accordingly when I talked about translation mode saves. And that's pagination mode. Next is video mode, and most of these items for video mode are the exact same copy-pasted items from pagination mode, because video mode is almost identical to pagination mode. If you think about it, a matching translation visual audiobook video is mostly just a succession of screens, and a screen is a lot like a piece of paper turned sideways. Checklist item 4-1, video mode is for fitting outputs to a computer screen and timing those. It includes the lines and chunks form of a translation, but not the paragraph form. Just like pagination mode, it's for the lines and chunks form and doesn't deal with the paragraph form. Checklist item 4-5, in the translations of chunks, pilcrow marks are hidden in video mode and they don't do any formatting thing, same as in pagination mode, since the pilcrow marks only apply to paragraph form, which only appears in translation mode. Checklist item 4-2, the video resolution is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and the frame rate is 30 frames per second. That's hard-coded and cannot be adjusted by the user, like the paper size in pagination mode. Okay, same display settings. Checklist item 4-7, set whether the will or won't include a gloss. Checklist item 4-8, set whether it will or won't have pronunciation showing. Checklist item 4-9, can decide whether you got 2 translations or 1 or none showing. Checklist item 4-10, can set the font size for source text, pronunciation text, gloss text, and the translation text. And the 4 settings apply to all screens in the whole document in video mode, and what that means is that you can't, at least in this version, you can't set different lines to different font sizes. Okay, same alignment note we've seen twice before now, like from the Latin example, thing about columns, widest member, alignment based on those. Same thing about when you want a chunks translation center aligned and a left aligned note below it, with the mark //l// appears in translation mode, and then does the formatting thing in video mode. And the same awkwardly worded thing about text wrap. Line breaks in chunks are handled automatically by the program. Just to be clear again, that means that if a chunks translation is wider than the screen, then the program just automatically decides where on the display one line ends and the next line begins, like when you type a paragraph into a word processor. Not talking about line break characters or anything like that. And then we have the same thing about fitting screens horizontally and vertically, like in pagination mode, about fitting pieces of paper horizontally and vertically. Checklist item 4-11. If any that don't fit, the program tells the user, and checklist item 4-12, if any don't fit vertically, the program tells the user. Okay, something I should have mentioned earlier about line breaks and chunk breaks and page breaks. The user doesn't deal with line break characters or any special characters for any of those kinds of breaks. Those are all managed with buttons in the program once some source text is imported. So before importing a text, let's say we go to Word Guy on cText, and it's in this massive block of text with no spaces and no line breaks. Now suppose we copy out this section of the scroll into WordPad, and the next thing to do is break it into lines in WordPad or whatever word processor you're using. So you break it into lines, and those line breaks can be tentative, and then you import the source text into Autoglosser, and once you do that, you can see where the line breaks and the chunk breaks are. And then when you want to add a line break or remove one, or add a chunk break or remove one, that's all done with buttons in Autoglosser at that point. And you can see where there's a line and then another line below it. You can infer that there's a line break between them. And you can see where there's a set of lines with a chunk translation and then another set of lines with a chunk translation. You can infer that there's a chunk break between those chunks. As for page breaks, let's say those show up as horizontal dotted lines in translation mode. And those can only be put where there are chunk breaks. The way you can think about grouping is that there's some number of lines and those are grouped into some number of chunks, where each chunk is any number of one or more lines, and then those chunks are grouped into pages, where each page is any number of one or more chunks. That's how to think about grouping, and the way that's managed is that there's some number of line breaks, and some of those line breaks also have chunk breaks with them, and some of those chunk breaks also have page breaks with them. Alright, that's all the similarities between video mode and pagination mode. Let's talk about what video mode does that pagination mode doesn't do. We'll assume the user already knows how to use some program for recording the vocal track and has a microphone, possibly knows how to edit in an audio editing program to chop out outtakes and such. Autoglosser is not an audio editing program. Audio editing programs already exist. And about the difference between a screen and a piece of paper, since a screen is much wider horizontally and shorter vertically than a piece of paper, we'll suppose that if someone wants to prepare a translation both for printing and for a matching translation video, the workflow will go as follows. The user finishes making a translation using translation mode and map mode, then makes 2 copies of his save, and in one of those saves prepares it for printing using pagination mode, and in the other save prepares it for video using video mode, and once he's done preparing both of those 2 saves are going to have completely different sets of page breaks, and perhaps he's also reworked the line breaks so the video can have longer lines than the print form. And hey, there was one last note listed under translation mode that we didn't cover yet. Translation mode, note 2, about constraints. The text in translation mode in the lines and chunks form isn't constrained to anything. The source text is not constrained to the source material after importing like some other document on the computer. The glossed words are not constrained to the map once you apply them in translation mode. The translation in the paragraph format is constrained to the translation in lines and chunks form, and the text in pagination mode and video mode is constrained to the translation in lines and chunks form, and the map isn't constrained to anything. So there's a 1 thing constrained to and 3 things constraining to it. There's the text in translation mode in lines and chunks form, and constrained to that are the text in translation mode in paragraph form, and the text in pagination mode, and the text in video mode. There was some awkward wording there. When I said source text is not constrained to the source material, yeah, I just meant that once you import the source text, the program's not keeping track of whatever other document you copied that in from, as I've said earlier. Alright, so what we see in video mode and pagination mode is constrained to what's in translation mode. That means that whenever some text is changed in translation mode, those changes show up once you go from there to pagination mode or video mode. Alright, onward to what makes video mode different from pagination mode. Video mode, note 1, video mode is very similar to pagination mode. Basically, the 3 differences are video mode deals with things fitting to a computer screen rather than a piece of paper, and video mode keeps a list of timestamps for when screens are to appear and disappear, and video mode keeps a value of the setting for fade durations. Right, a matching translation visual audiobook has screens that appear and disappear, like the first screen appears for a while, then stays on screen for a while, then disappears, and then there's a blank screen briefly, and then the second screen appears, etc. It's kind of like flipping through the pages of a book, which is why video mode just uses the same page break system as pagination mode, but to define what's on one screen and what's on the next screen, rather than what's on one page and what's on the next page. And this kind of video is very simple. Let's have a look at my video editor project for part of the word guy matching translation from when I was doing that inefficiently. We're looking at somewhere in the middle of the timeline, and there's an audio track that runs the whole length of the video, and on the video track there's a screen that appears, stays for a while, disappears, and then the next screen appears, stays for a while, disappears, etc. Well, since we've already detailed how screens are determined, there's little more information to add in order to define a video. Checklist item 4-13, user can import a list of timestamps as text. For example, if the text with all the timestamps says 0:1.0, new line 0:10.5, new line 0:13.25, new line 0:19.75. That means screen 1 appears at 0 minutes and 1 seconds and disappears at 0 minutes and 10.5 seconds, and then screen 2 appears at 0 minutes 13.25 seconds and disappears at 0 minutes 19.75 seconds, and so on for however many screens are to show up. So if there's a total of 20 screens, we need a total of 40 timestamps like that, and altogether that defines when each screen appears and when each screen disappears. Let's also assume that the user is using some other program to generate that list of timestamps. I don't know exactly what tool I would use for that, but perhaps there's some free add-on for Audacity where you can take an audio track and just place a bunch of marks on it and then export the numbers like that. Or a user could do that manually in any audio player. So once he imports the full list of timestamps into Autoglosser, he's defined the start and end times for each screen. Checklist item 4-14. User can set the duration of fade-ins and fade-outs, or set to have no fades. The fades are timed so that the end of a fade-in is at the value of a timestamp, fade-in starts a few frames before the stamp, and the start of a fade-out is at the value of the timestamp, fade-out ends a few frames after the stamp. Let's say the user sets the fade duration to 10 frames and has given timestamps saying the first screen start is at the 1 second mark and the first screen's end is at the 10.5 second mark. In that case, the first screen should start fading in at 1/3 of a second before the 1 second mark and finish fading in at the 1 second mark, and the first screen should start fading out at the 10.5 second mark and finish fading out 1/3 of a second later. The next note is about saves, like the note about saves in pagination mode. Video mode, note 3, see translation mode, item 1-24 about saves. Saves in video mode contain the stuff to save about the work in video mode, which is just the font sizes, timestamps, fade duration setting, plus whatever is going on in translation mode, and the stuff to save about pagination mode, which is also erroneous. Video mode saves also have to include the settings about whether the pronunciation is shown or hidden, whether the gloss is shown or hidden, and whether 2 or 1 or no translations are shown. Maybe some other things, revise item Y1-24 accordingly. And now about outputs. I don't know if it's difficult for a programmer to make a program that outputs MP4 video, but there are a few other options. Consider this animation. I made a program that outputs all the frames for a video with one picture file for each frame. And in one of the video editing programs I use sometimes, you can import all the frames, drag them all onto the timeline, set the duration to 1 frame each, and then you essentially have a flipbook animation. Well, if it's too hard to make a program that outs to MP4 video, how about if Autoglosser outputs a massive pile of picture files for the same flipbooking process? That might blow up the memory of a computer. Video mode note 2. An older draft of this specification said it would be okay if the output is in the form of 1 picture file per frame for assembling in a video editing program, but that would mean 1,800 losslessly compressed picture files per minute of video to assemble. At that rate, a 20-minute video would require 36,000 picture files totaling about 7 gigabytes, which is just a little too unwieldy, so this shouldn't be considered a good way to make a hacky output form. For example, if the first screen appears at the 1 second mark and disappears at the 10.5 second mark with no fade, this solution would result in an output of a picture file called frame 1 that's just a blank screen, and then a picture file called frame 2 that's just a blank screen, then 28 more picture files called frame 3 through 30 that are all blank screens, and then a picture file called frame 31 that's, say, this screen of a matching translation, and then a picture file called frame 32 that's identical, and then 283 more picture files called frame 33 through frame 315 that are all identical, and so on for the rest of the screens. I don't know if my video editing program could handle more than a minute worth of that kind of output, and all the intermediate throughput would not be fun to store on a computer. Thus, checklist item 4-15, for output any of the following is fine. outputs MP4 video complete with audio and video, or outputs MP4 video with no audio track for the user to assemble with the audio track in a video editing program, or outputs a save file that opens in any free video editing program, for example Blender VSE or HitFilm, resulting in a timeline with all the right stuff on it, or outputs something that can be used with an import script or some such button in any free video editing program, resulting in a timeline with all the right stuff on it. Alright, if it's not too hard to make a program that outputs a silent MP4 video, great. Have Autoglosser output a silent MP4 and have the user pair that up with the audio track in a video editing program. Or if it's not too hard to make a program that also takes the audio file and outputs a MP4 with video and audio, even better. If those aren't viable, other options include having the program output all the screens, one picture file each, not 1,000, and output a save file that opens in any free video editing program. I mostly use HitFilm for video editing because it's free and for most operations works better than the other program I used to use, and I think HitFilm saves in plain text. If I open my HitFilm project save for WordGuy Scroll 1 Track 1 in Vim, it looks like this, and the first line is a tag saying it's XML, and the rest of the save is a single second line that runs to 106,000 characters, so I don't know if it would be easy or difficult to mess with that as a program output. And the other option is if there's a free video editing program that supports scripting and has a handy scripting language that makes it easy to give it this information. But I don't know anything about that, like if that's even a thing. And that's video mode, and that takes us to the last two notes, those of the miscellaneous section, followed by closing remarks. Checklist item 5-1, the program either comes with a exe installer or instructions on how to install it that make sense to someone who is not a software expert. And checklist item 5-2, the program is either launched by running an exe or there are instructions on how to launch the program that make sense to someone who is not a software expert. And if I'm talking to computer experts right now, I do have to spell this out. Hello computer expert, here's what happens most of the time when an ordinary human being sees a GitHub page. There's a web browser and it's open to a GitHub page and there's some code there and then, oh, that's some nifty looking code. I have no idea how I would get my computer to run this. Like, no idea. There's a README and it has several things to say in some moon language, but nothing about installing or running it. Is it F5? No, F5 in a web browser is refresh, not run. Well, that is some lovely code, spectacular, and I have no idea how to tell a computer to run it. When something comes with an installer that's an exe file and you can double click to run it, that's something an ordinary human being knows how to do, especially when the install process generates an exe for launching a program once the program is installed. Personally, I know little about how to do anything on a computer other than double-click on the installer to install it, and then double-click on the launcher to launch it. Which is not to say that I'm an ordinary human being, I'm actually a cat. But that's how a thing has to be for someone who is not a computer expert to use a thing. That's all the checklist items of the first version of the specification and all the notes to those items. And all that's left to this video is a few pertinent remarks. Alright, as of the time of this recording, the first video has been up for a while, and some people who saw it have joined the Discord. After they joined, I finished the first version of the specification, made all the checklist items and the notes you've seen on screen, and I finished the first 7 minutes of this video talking about those notes and demonstrating the ideas visually, and I thought that might be the handoff at that point, but they said that I didn't make complete sense in all the places in the written specification. That's entirely on me. I had to figure out a lot of things in order to write that up, and I'm sure I lost enough objectivity along the way to fail to express all the ideas adequately in writing, and that's why I've made the rest of this video discussing the specification. Those people also had notes on how to do some things better based on parts of the specification that did make sense, but they didn't specify those improvements in the form of complete specifications, and that's also on me. Of course, I have to do an adequate job of explaining the first iteration completely before anyone else can revise that and describe completely how to do things better. That's just the course of how time works. So now that I've filled in the rest of the details describing the specification with visual demonstrations, and I can only hope that I've made complete sense in attempting that, it's now possible, as of right around now, that other people can iterate that up. So the plan we agreed on is that it's on me to do this video and post it, and then the next task is it's on them to iterate up the design further, in terms also of complete specifications, and then program it. As such, it's finally time for that handoff as about right now, if I'm not mistaken. So this specification I've done is not in a fully technical form of specifying things like which algorithms and data structures to use. Doesn't even have any mention of what programming language to use. That's because I'm not a real programmer. Heck, if I were a real programmer, I probably could have made this program in a lot less time than it took me to describe it to this level of detail. but this is a nearly complete specification of the slightly less technical level. I've described almost completely everything in terms of operations, user interactions, workflows, and purposes. I didn't go into every single detail like what the buttons look like or even what the exact series of steps of some of the user interactions and a few other technical incompletenesses. There was an item that says you can go from translation mode to map mode and another one that says you can go from map mode to translation mode, but I forgot to include items saying that you can go from translation mode to pagination mode and any of the other combinations. And there was an item that says that there's never a screen forgot to refresh glitch in translation mode, but not a similar one for map mode. And I suppose there are many error handling things that I could have specified further, like in video mode, if the fade duration is set to half a second and one screen is set to appear 3/4 of a second after one disappears, do the fades overlap? Does one start fading in while the previous one is still fading out? Or are both of the fades truncated to prevent overlapping? The specification is almost to that level of technically complete, and nothing's stopping anyone from filling in the rest of those details in an addendum or further iteration. As such, if I'm not mistaken, this could be called a good enough specification for a complete specification for a computer program. And if I'm not mistaken, it's now something appropriate to hand off to real programmers to iterate up the design further and implement it, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of that. I do have to talk a little bit more about the range of uses this might have to make sure further iterations don't stifle any of the use cases I can think of. There are many different styles of translations, not just considering the scale between literal and interpretive translations or direct and natural translations, but further, translations of different source materials can result in translation workflows with vastly different characteristics. For example, if someone wants to make a glossed translation of a modern German novel into English, and if there's a good word mapping one can simply import, then the process of making a translation with gloss will go pretty quickly. Most German words translate simply into English words, and most words in a modern German novel will be words of those sorts. But all bets are off when it comes to translating Heidegger. And how much moreover when someone's translating ancient Chinese, which is where I'm coming from. Translating ancient Chinese is a little more tricky for several reasons. For one, there might be some words in one language that don't translate simply into words in other languages. And there might be some words from antiquated ontologies that don't translate simply into modern words of any kind. Like in ancient Chinese works, you're likely to encounter the word qi, and in modern Chinese it just means air or gas or smell or weather, but in ancient Chinese it means something like vitality or the vital energy or the élan vital, pardon my French. Actually, lots of these ancient idea words translate from ancient Chinese to ancient Greek better than they do to any modern language. Dao is logos, de is phronesis or arete, qi is pneuma, etc. That's the issue when it comes to working with text about old ideas, but we have related issues just translating modern languages. How would you translate the word Harambe or Ubuntu into a single word in English? Can't be done. These are concepts that can be expressed in single words in some languages, but not others. And now consider the word qing. It can be translated as green or blue. How's that? The word green in English never means blue, and blue never means green, so how can something be either? Well, just like any basic color words, it spans a range of hues, and the center of that range is somewhere around turquoise or aquamarine or greenish blue or bluish green. Anyways, aside from colors, when you're dealing with words from languages very foreign, there are a lot of concept words in one language that map to in between the concepts for words in other language. It will happen more often if you're translating modern Chinese into English than when you're translating modern German into English. So when I'm translating ancient Chinese, I like to build up a word mapping one word at a time and one meaning at a time, especially because there are many Chinese characters that have about a dozen different translations into English words that seem to have little to do with each other. That's partly because of accretion, since Chinese has been using the same characters for an extremely long time. Most of the words of Chinese spoken today have been around for at least 2,000 years, which is positively bizarre when you think about the linguistics of any other language. It's the character system of Chinese has made it incredibly resistant to change. While the pronunciations have changed a lot in 2,000 years, and the way the characters are written has also changed a lot, but according to a very concise program. Most Chinese characters are made of parts called radicals, and the way those radicals are written has changed over time, but if you apply those changes to the radicals across all characters, then the characters have remained the same aside from that. With that considered, many of those words are more like 3,000 years old, not 2,000. But aside from that stasis in the writing system, the meanings of the words have changed more comparably to how they do in other languages, and that's why you have so many different meanings for one word sometimes when translating Chinese. And to be perfectly honest, when I look up the meaning of a Chinese word and I find that it has many, I don't know which of those pertain only to ancient Chinese and which are more modern adaptations. For example, the word zhuang can mean farmer or it can mean serious. Did it mean only one of those and not the other anciently, and did it pick up the other meaning more modernly? I pretty much never know the answer to those questions when I look up words.
Etc. You're not lying.
And that's why I like to build up my maps one word at a time and one meaning at a time, and so far I've also done that with reference to other translations, but maybe sometime soon I'll be proficient enough to try a first ever translation of something. There is a massive Chinese to English dictionary called ggggg that's in some plain text form that programmers can do programmy things with, but I don't think I would simply want to load in ggggg as my map and start glossing something. I would rather refer to a number of dictionaries, ggggg included, and use context to make sure I'm building up a map with meanings that only pertain to certain modes of word usage, namely the ancient stuff I do. And sometimes I encounter a word in Chinese and it simply turns no results in Google Translate or the mouse over dictionary I'm using as a Chrome extension, or any of the Chinese to English online dictionaries I'm using, or the concise Oxford Chinese English dictionary, or the full tome-sized Oxford Chinese English dictionary they conveniently have at my local library. So the process of translating a scroll often ends up in the late stages being like a substitution cipher with many mysteries all to work out in combination with each other and with the words you're more sure about. All this requires the freedom to do a lot of messing around with the map. Another nice feature of building up a map from scratch while translating a book is that you end up with a map just for that book that contains all and only those words found in that book. Hey, that's a useful learning resource to pair up with a matching glossed translation. Sort of like how a typical language learning book alternates between new vocab and then dialogues that contain the new vocab words. A matching glossed translation plus a word mapping just for that book is basically the same thing, but on the level of a whole book. So, translating an ancient Chinese scroll and translating a modern German novel using a good dictionary are vastly different enterprises. And however we're going to iterate up this program into better versions, let's make sure it stays robust enough to handle the range of use cases and doesn't stifle any in favor of others. As for styles of translation, so too for different styles of learning. The range of things Autoglosser could be used for might be to make a range of books for vastly differing purposes. One person might want to read just some foreign language poetry in its original language, and someone else might want to use translations for learning a language to conversational fluency. The person who is learning for conversational fluency will ideally want to get through a big amount of text at a decent speed and want books that stay within some given proficiency level, and the person learning foreign language poetry probably wants to read fewer things and more deliberately. I personally decided a long time ago that I don't want to learn modern Chinese to conversational fluency because of the sheer number of hours of study it takes, which, yes, has been quantified quite exactly and rigorously. But I have messed around using Anki, the flashcard app, for a few hours just to get an idea of what tools are popular for that. Anki has found most of its use in language learning, and it's good for some purposes if we're comparing it to other existing resources, but I can imagine a related project that's just a little bit different in a few important ways being massively more useful than Anki for language learning, and that product could be Autoglosser plus another program that works with it. I won't mention exactly what that is for now because at the moment I'm just a little bit tired of imagining programs to the point of full descriptions, but I see some various ways that Autoglosser could go after the first working version. By the way, I've never actually read The Art of War, but I saw some piece of advice somewhere, I don't remember where, that said that if you've read The Art of War, you should never make it known that you've read The Art of War. So all those facts I happened to mention about it earlier, I also learned those from I don't remember where, but not from reading it, which I haven't, and don't plan to. Alright, that's all the things I have to say about this description of this specification of this program by way of closing remarks. Fare thee well. Wait a minute, I almost forgot. Here beginneth the book of the Tales of Canterbury. One that April with his shores sought, the draught of March had pierced to the rot, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. One Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath. The tender croppus and the younge sun, hath in the ram his halfe coursey run, and small fowl as maken melody, that slepen all the nicht with open ee. So pricketh him nature in her courages, that longen folk to goon on pilgrimages.